Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. And as was indicated, I will be talking about airborne transmission of SARS-CoV-2 and the implications of this for linked into the dental industry. So as was said, I'm Kim Prather, professor at UC San Diego. Next slide, please. So I have no financial relationships to disclose or conflicts of interest. Learning objectives, basically what I will cover are the different possible modes of transmission and basically how infectious respiratory aerosols and droplets are actually being produced, and the evidence that we have established, which is growing and growing over the course of the pandemic, for the airborne transmission of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that produces COVID-19. And finally, I'll talk about the two modes that appear to be the dominant modes, which is aerosol inhalation of aerosols, both from long and short range, predominantly in indoor places. So next, please. All right, so these are just a traditional view of transmission routes, and they have sort of stood the test of time. And it has been a wild ride over the last almost year and a half, trying to sort of get outside of the box and really learn something. We've learned a lot about this respiratory virus, but the silver lining I love to tell people is that the things that we've learned about this virus, I think, are going to cause us to think about other viruses and other types of respiratory illnesses, and we can fix those now too. But we think about either direct contact, where we touch the surface, or we get coughed or sneezed on, or aerosols. So droplets produce, you see the spray, and that spray, that usually will only affect you if you're right up close. But aerosols are also produced up close, and you don't have to cough or sneeze. And so, as Nancy mentioned, basically we produce aerosols simply by speaking. And so lots of aerosols come out of us all the time. We are aerosol generating, I would say AGP is aerosol generating people. So basically people without symptoms have led to a lot of the spread of this disease. Next slide, please. So this is, sort of a summary, and if you can click like 3 more times, I think it would be good. Yep. Ooh, I got it. So these are the different modes sort of visually, and this lays it out really well. And this is actually a slide that I have borrowed from Lindsay Marr, who also who's been talking about virus spread for more than a decade. But basically, this is kind of the current view of what we think is happening. As was mentioned, many times we can't screen people. We don't know if they're sick. Taking a temperature is not very effective. Many people don't have any symptoms, and so they're out in public walking around or visiting dentist offices. So there's basically, just by talking, there's a high concentration of aerosols. So there's 2 things that come out of you when you speak. Aerosols, which tend to float. They float very much, if you can visualize what it looks like seeing a cigarette smoker. You see it sort of waft up in the air. It's not falling to the ground, versus droplets, which drop. So droplets drop, aerosols float. And so basically, the aerosols just can remain suspended in the air, especially indoor air, especially poorly ventilated indoor air, for hours. And so if it's not ventilated and there's a person in there speaking, it can actually, it can build up over time. Very analogous to cigarette smoke. So we think the most dominant mode is short range, where you're close to that person. So that's why ventilation, we talk about ventilation and filtration, but also keeping your distance. Again, in dentistry, that's not always an option. So the way to protect yourself, you have to think about this. But you can also get it just by, as I say, it can travel long distances. Aerosols go much, much further than 6 feet. They can go miles, actually. They get diluted, though. So what we see is much more of an effect. Many more people, 20 times, they're likely to get infected indoors versus outdoors. And so, basically indoors, it can build up, whereas outdoors, it becomes quickly diluted. And so that's kind of the picture that we have. Next slide, please. So just, actually, that is so this is sort of, actually not yet, sorry, that's somehow lost the caption at the top. This is basically, the caption should say that aerosols go much further than 6 feet. And this is just a visualization of what that looks like. So the red are droplets, which can quickly fall to the ground. But if somebody does cough or sneeze, they're given an initial sort of kick, and they can even go, much further than 6 feet, in fact. And so distance is really, really important. If you go to the next slide, this slide was a key slide that I borrowed it from Lindsay Marr, and I showed, this is a slide I showed in a debrief of Dr. Fauci to sort of help overturn this sort of belief that only things that are really tiny, aerosols less than 5 microns, has always been the cut for over 100 years. Only the super tiny stuff will float. The rest of it will fall to the ground, and that is not true. It turns out that size cut should be closer to 100 microns. And so things, over a huge range, the respiratory droplets that come in aerosols that come out of us can go much, much further. This shows how much further they can go. If they start out with sort of a low indoor air velocity, they can go as far as 100 meters of 5 microns, so much further. This is sort of as they're settling, if there's nothing carrying them along, which is actually usually not the case. But if there's a high indoor air velocity, they can go even further. And things, as I say, all the way up to 100 microns can go much further than 6 feet, which we, sort of has been an arbitrary magical cut that you're somehow protected if you're outside of that range. It's just not the case. And so if you're indoors with other people in a room sharing the air, and that person is infectious, the chance of you getting infected can be quite high. Now, it comes back to not everybody who has, one of the, I guess you could say almost good news is, not everybody that has it spreads it equally. So there's some, what we call super shedders. They're people, or it's a point in their infection where they just produce thousands to millions of times more infectious aerosols. So if you're unlucky, and these people are only represent maybe 10 to 20% of those that are infected, if you are unlucky and in the room with one of those people, your chance of becoming infected, if you're not wearing a mask, if you're not distanced, if it's not properly ventilated, is actually quite high. The other point I want to make about this slide is that, I have looked back at sort of how things have been traditionally measured in the dental field. And, I've noticed that the most common thing is to put down settling plates to try and look at exposure. And that, that's not telling you what the aerosols are doing. The aerosols will remain in the air. You need airborne sampling. You need airborne measurements to actually be able to assess the aerosols that are produced from the many different procedures that are used. Next slide. So if you want to just click through this one, oh boy, it should be a black background. Somehow that got lost. Sorry about that, but I think we can still, yeah, shoot. It lost its formatting in the somehow. Anyway, so this is going to be interesting to explain. Let me see if I can say. So basically, this is sort of the layout of all the evidence for why we think the dominant pathway is exposure, inhalation exposure through the air, not by just touching surfaces. So this is just a few examples of the different studies that have been published. And basically, again, it's sort of, there's quite a bit of evidence that shows that people don't have symptoms. Either they're pre-symptomatic, asymptomatic, they just don't have symptoms. And those people are the ones that are out at the gym and can actually produce quite a few aerosols. Historically, again, back to the medical field, we hear about AGMPs, aerosol generating medical procedures. There's also AGDPs, as many of you are familiar with. AGMPs, though, have historically been the only time when people in the medical field, healthcare workers, are given proper, I would argue, proper access to the right PPE. In particular, they are given respirators or N95 masks, which is what everyone which is the only way to protect against inhaling aerosol. It's the best way, I should say. It's not the only way, but it is the most effective way to filter out aerosols. Again, if you think to the medical field, you think to dental offices, you see a lot of people walking around with medical masks, surgical masks. Those are designed to block droplets. Those do not work for aerosols. Aerosols can leak out the little gaps in the side unless you there's braces you can get to actually make them more effective. But my point is that there's been this long-standing belief that the only time you need an N95 or a respirator is if you're doing an aerosol generating procedure. And what I want to sort of point out is that we have now learned that this virus is in the air. There's, again, this sort of shows all the different, usually I step through these, but it shows all of the different ways. We've seen the virus in the air through the RNA, through genomics, from sampling. We've also seen that it remains infectious. That was always a question. And a lot of people said, oh, it's not airborne because it's not infectious. well, they have never actually been able to culture measles out of the air. So this one is actually, you know, we're much further down the path of acknowledging that this one is airborne. And now, finally, after over a year of pushing, we finally, both WHO and CDC, have at least acknowledged that aerosol transmission is occurring. There's still some arguments, I guess, if you will. People are holding on to these sort of medical dogmas that droplets could still be important. And there are just not as many droplets. There's thousands of times more aerosols than droplets, and aerosols stay up and droplets fall. So it is, over time, I've become much stronger in my belief and sort of getting the points across. The science shows that it is in the aerosol form. Next slide, please. All right, you want me to step through these. So I'll just go through the examples. There's you can't even put them all on, but where does it happen? We hear about these super spreader events, and these are all mostly indoors, low ventilation, people not wearing masks, which now we're not required to, and their CDC has dropped this, which is problematic, I think, for workers. The longer you're inhaling, the higher the risk becomes. And you produce more actually when you speak. Breathing produces some, but speaking produces more, and yelling produces even more. And singing, as Shelly Miller has published a paper on, choirs can produce quite a few. But there's been outbreaks in gyms, choirs. That Miller is Shelly Miller. Restaurants, yeah, you can see this. If you want to click that, thank you. You can see that this is actually people all at one end of the restaurant all got infected where the air got trapped. The rest of the restaurant didn't get it, but everyone at the families at all three of those tables, many of them got infected. The other thing that happened was there was a chorist in Australia who went in, he was greater than 15 meters away from the people that got infected, which you can see on here. He basically sang over a course of a couple of days, infected people. The key point, the people were behind him. So there's no, droplets, I always say droplets don't do U-turns. Aerosols float, cigarette smoke, it can go every direction. And so this really hammers home the importance of aerosols over droplets. And also there was experiments done with animals where they put bends. You can see this has 4 90-degree bends, and we're able to show basically blow air from an infected ferret up to the other ferret, had to go around all these turns. Droplets don't do turns well either. And so only the aerosols could be what we're actually carrying it to get it to lead to the infection in the ferret at the top. Okay, next slide, please. All right, I just want to drive home this point about, and you can click through, there's more, drive through this point that these are, sort of gives you the relative magnitude. When I say AGMPs are, not producing many aerosols, that's come out over this, basically become a big part. It's one of the big findings of this pandemic. And you can see that coughing, exercise, shouting, coughing all produce many, many more aerosols than what we traditionally called AGMPs. Now, what's the problem with this? The problem with this is that, in the case, we give workers masks, proper N95 masks for the AGMPs, but we do not when they're just talking to people. And since we don't know who's infectious, this is a serious, serious problem that has led to a significant amount of spread of this disease. And so this is just something that has been highlighted quite a bit, but it's still, I still am finding myself over and over saying it's in the air. You're inhaling it in the air. CDC has now said the risk of transmission on surfaces is very low. Less than 1 in 10,000 times of touching a contaminated surface, you will get infected. Okay, next. All right, so if you want to read more about this, we published a paper recently in The Lancet, and it has been, has had a huge effect worldwide, which is great to see. But we basically just laid out the overwhelming amount of evidence, 10 very independent lines of evidence, all 10 point at aerosol transmission and inhalation as being the key to the spread of this virus. And so these are the 10 just sort of laid out. Many of the things I think I've said, most of these along through this talk. But again, if you want to, Trish Greenhalgh is the lead author, and it was published and it's circulated the world in many languages. And so if you want to learn more about how we know that it's airborne, I encourage you to look at this article. Next slide. So just click again, please. So the point is, and again, thank you. So the point is, we now, CDC even has acknowledged that it is air in the air, that surfaces are unlikely. They haven't ruled out, they still are using the word droplets. Some of that is just they're holding on to the old definition, the 5 microns. We haven't quite gotten there. We published a paper in Science, a letter saying it should be shifted to 100 microns so that we're all using the same language. We're not quite there yet. But I think we're really close to sort of saying, okay, it's in the air. The problem is the CDC and WHO have said it, but they haven't said it. They haven't said it as strongly, in my view, as they should, because people are still confused. People are still doing what we call hygiene theater. Wiping surfaces makes you feel good, but I won't say it's a total waste of time. You should still make sure your surfaces are clean, but doing it at the frequency and the time that we've done it is not necessary, I would say. But we still want to keep clean surfaces, but we really need to be cleaning the air. Okay, next slide, please. So what is needed? This is the last slide, and I think we can have time for discussion afterwards. So my job in this was to present the evidence, talk about why we know that this virus is airborne. But what about the dental office environment? Clearly, there's more measurements that are needed of size distributions of the aerosols, like in real time, like while you're doing the procedures. That would be a dream. There's ways you can we have these measurements. You just put it in a lab or into the office, and you could just be measuring aerosol sizes and concentrations through all of your procedures. And I think that really needs to be done. We need to move beyond settling plates. That's not looking at the aerosols. That tells you nothing about what people are inhaling, very little, I should say. We want to start moving towards control mitigations for it being airborne. Staff, even the people out working at a desk, if they're close, that air is going all through the whole dental office. And there have been quite a few outbreaks. We don't know as much about them as we should. I think this will start to become more obvious. All employees ideally are vaccinated. Vaccines work, they're great. And finally, as Shelly's going to talk about, there are ways to clean the air in the dental offices. I think I have a couple more and then I'm done. These are just references if people want, because I think they'll share the slides. Another one, please. These are the references that back up all the things that I talked about. And then the next slide, please. My next slide was just thank you for questions, but that's not there. So we'll just stop here. And I hope we'll have a good discussion after the next two talks. So thank you.